Hello everyone. Please make yourself comfortable and enjoy the cozy atmosphere of my study, because we have a long journey to the past ahead of us tonight. I will take you to Antiquity again, and this time to talk about ancient deities, gods and goddesses that at some point became prominent or very well known in the societies that worshipped them, before falling into oblivion. Not fully. To some of us, their names may ring a bell, but most people don't really know what there was behind these names. So, tonight I will tell you about Sol Invictus, or Sol Invictus, if we want to pronounce it like the Romans did. Sol Invictus was the sun god of the Romans that remained relatively obscure for centuries, before turning into one of the most, if not the most, influential cult of the Roman Empire in the late 3rd century and early 4th century AD. A widely held theory is that the Church, the Christians, chose December the 25th as Jesus Christ's birthday, as Christmas, to absorb or appropriate the yearly festival of Sol Invictus that was held on the same date. The 25th of December was the traditional day of the winter solstice for the Romans. We will see why and how Sol Invictus rose to prominence in the late Roman Empire, and if the claim that the date of Christmas was chosen to capitalize on his festival is that solid, because there is still an open debate among historians. After Sol Invictus, I will tell you about Mithra, an Iranian god that crossed the Middle East and inspired a cult in ancient Rome too. But a cult of a particular type, a mystery religion, a religion that was reserved to initiates. We will see what that meant. And there will be more. After Mithra, I will tell you about Inanna, a goddess of love and fertility in ancient Mesopotamia, and one of the most ancient known deities in the world. But she didn't disappear with the Sumerian civilization where she first appeared. Under the name of Ishtar, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, which are ulterior Mesopotamian civilizations, kept worshipping her, and she may have influenced the development of other deities, including the Greek Aphrodite. After thousands of years of prominence in the Middle East, her cult finally declined and disappeared in the first centuries of our era, in the wake of Christianization. Inanna, or Ishtar, was generally a benevolent figure. A much more threatening entity of Mesopotamia was the demon Pazuzu, also mostly forgotten, but I'll tell you about him. And finally, we will revisit the rise and fall of Aten, the Egyptian sun disk that Pharaoh Akhenaten tried to impose as a superior cult to all other Egyptian gods. Unsuccessfully, because immediately after his death, Akhenaten was deemed heretical. His new capital, Amarna, was abandoned. So, as you see, we have a lot to explore tonight. And this will take us from secret shrines in Rome to the sands of Egypt and the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, these massive structures upon which temples were built. Just take a deep breath and then breathe normally and let the sound of my voice guide you. As you now know well, if you are familiar with this channel, you can also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music and other music streaming apps. You will find links in the description. Or on Patreon, listening to everything with or without background sounds, and downloading the stories and videos are some of the perks that you get if you choose to support the channel. I also invite you to check out Lights Out Library and La Biblioteca de los Sueños, the two podcasts that consist of my stories retold by Olympia in English and Spanish respectively. If you wish to try a different voice, a different take and a different accent. And now, let's get started with our forgotten gods. Our first stop takes us to ancient Rome and the figure of Sol Invictus. When we think of Roman gods, the Roman pantheon, we tend to think about the Roman equivalents of Greek gods, the ones that gave their names to planets: Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Neptune, Saturn. These were obviously well known by all Romans and Romanized peoples across the Republic and later the Roman Empire. But in the city of Rome, many more deities were worshipped. There were lesser known Roman gods like Sol, and foreign deities too. Rome was also a cultural crossroads, with communities from all around the Mediterranean. So you found temples to gods from Egypt or the Levant. For centuries prior to the 3rd century AD, the Romans had worshipped a god named Sol, the sun, which in all the writings and archaeological remains was often called Sol Indigus, meaning the deified sun. Before becoming Sol Invictus in the later period, meaning the invincible sun. There is an ongoing debate among experts about the cult of Sol a long time. Historically, the consensual view among scholars and archaeologists was that the Roman had adopted two different gods named Sol successively. The first one, Sol Indigus, would have declined and be forgotten, and only later another one, Sol Invictus, would have been imported from the Middle East, from Syria, by emperors who were devotees of this deity. And it would have been this originally foreign Sol Invictus that would have arrived in Rome and be elevated to one of the most important divine figures for a few decades. But in the past 30 years, this view has been challenged with strong arguments, and a second school of historians now thinks it was the same god all along, because they are not very different, and Sol Invictus is only loosely connected to Syria. They also argue that the difference in names, Indigus or Invictus, is not really relevant, because other deities had the term Invictus added to their names. There are records of Apollo Invictus or Jupiter Invictus, for example, and even several emperors had this term Invictus added right after their names. So the fact that Sol was referred to as Sol Invictus in the 3rd century could just be a new way of naming him, a new custom, rather than a different god. To make things just a bit more complicated, the iconography of Sol Invictus was also often misleading. The sun god was often represented as a beardless man, with a crown of spikes looking like sun rays, and often driving a chariot with 4 horses, which is an obvious reference to the sun crossing the sky each day. And in that it was close to its Greek equivalent, Helios. But this depiction of the sun god also became a symbol for the sun itself, without any religious connotation. That's why in Christian tombs of the 3rd or 4th centuries, or in ancient synagogues, portraits that look a lot like depictions of Sol Invictus were discovered. But that would be weird. Why would Christians or Jews depict a god that was pagan to them? The solution to this mystery is that it was not the god they represented, but just the symbol of the sun, a man driving a chariot with 4 horses. So all depictions of Sol Invictus are not necessarily religious. His image had come to symbolize the sun to almost everyone in the Roman Empire, and this makes it harder to understand the relevance, the importance of this cult to the Romans. These debates about the origins of Sol and the evolution of the cult are not necessarily closed yet, but we can leave them aside and look at the rise of Sol Invictus in the 3rd century to understand why it happened and how relevant this was. What made the cult of a god important, prominent, was a combination of things. Popular devotion was important, patronage from rich and powerful people too, and also how important, central the cult became in political and social life. As I told you in various past stories about ancient Rome, the Romans were not necessarily big on mysticism or spirituality. These things existed, certainly, but what dominated religious life in Rome, what was really visible, was the political and social significance of religion. Respecting cults, making offerings, participating in celebrations, in ceremonies, in festivals, was a way of showing that you belonged to Roman society. It was almost a civic duty, and actually believing in every single god was secondary, as long as you respected social conventions. And this aspect of traditional Roman religion, the way it was intertwined with social life, is one of the big reasons why religious minorities could be sometimes rejected and persecuted when they refused to play along. They were not rejected because their beliefs were considered false or bad. The Romans tolerated other gods, and they let foreigners worship whatever deity they wanted. They were rejected because they did not comply with Roman rules of civility. the Jews, and even worse later, the Christians, refused to play along and pay respect to Jupiter or Apollo. In their views, doing so would have been worshipping idols, which their scriptures explicitly forbid. So they condemned these traditional Roman gods as fake idols. And by doing so, they placed themselves out of society in the eyes of the Romans. Their behavior was considered antisocial and threatening to social order. That was not the only reason for persecutions. Attacking minorities and actively creating emissary gods is also an old trick that is as old as politics. And there was some of that. Xenophobia also probably came into play. Judaism or Christianity were Oriental cults in the eyes of the Romans. They were un-Roman. And there was also a problem specific to the Christian doctrine, which was all its discourse against the rich and its condemnation of wealth. We should be cautious with comparisons, but for a part, the Roman elite reacted to it like some of the bourgeois of the 19th century reacted to the rise of socialist ideas and Marxism. These were seen as mortal threats to social and economic order, threats that needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. For all these different reasons, these first Christians were really annoying and even threatening to a large part of the Roman society at the time. And this explains the persecutions. Returning to what made a cult influential in Rome, I was telling you that to be recognized among the top gods, a deity needed to be accepted by the Roman elite, the old patrician families, and have not only temples, but a group of priests and supporters recruited in this elite. This is what the cult of Sol Invictus achieved in the late 3rd century, after centuries of being a second-tier deity. And why this sudden change of status? Thanks primarily to a progressive gain in popularity and devotion in the army, and later the patronage of emperors. It began in the army, which was more solicited than ever in the 3rd century AD. The peak of the Roman Empire was the 2nd century, a period of internal stability, of expansion and prosperity, during which several consecutive emperors ruled successfully. But this golden age of ancient Rome came to an end in the 3rd century, which was a period of civil wars, of increased pressure on the frontiers, and of realization that the empire was too large and too extended to be administered centrally only from Rome. Eventually it would be reunified by force, and new ways of organizing the administration would be found. It was not the end for ancient Rome yet. But the empire never fully recovered from the destruction of this 3rd century crisis, especially the western part of the empire, where a lot of infrastructure was destroyed or damaged and would never be repaired. So, in this period, the Roman legions and regular troops were fighting almost continuously against foreigners on the frontiers, and even more against other Roman factions. It wasn't new in Roman history, but more than ever, controlling the military was the key to political power. Actual or aspiring emperors could not afford to lose support from their armies, because if they did, their days would be quickly numbered. And in the 3rd century, devotion to Sol became widespread in the Roman army. Sol became the personification of victory, and of all the good things that soldiers could aspire to. Instead of Mars, the god of war, Sol became the deity soldiers would pray and make small offerings to before battles, for example, while generals would ask for his support and promise to dedicate their eventual victory to him. At the time of promoting the cult of Sol, this was certainly not neutral. In a war-torn society, like Rome in the 3rd century, values and views coming from the military could tend to expand to civilian life and civilian society. A first attempt to advance the cult of Sol was made around 220 AD by Elagabalus, a minor emperor who reigned for a short time as a teenager before he was assassinated. This episode may be more accidental than really significant. Elagabalus had become a devotee of this Syrian sun god I mentioned earlier, and he tried to install this cult in Rome. This is one of the reasons for this old theory that Sol Invictus actually came from Syria and was not a Roman god. But in any case, it didn't work. The cult of Sol Invictus promoted by Elagabalus was not adopted by the population in Rome. At the time it was seen as an offense to traditional Roman gods, because it was a foreign deity, and the emperor was assassinated after 4 years of reign. So this first attempt was a wrong start. It really began to work 50 years later, in 274 AD, under an emperor of a different caliber, Aurelian. Aurelian is a major figure of Roman history in the 3rd century, because he did more than any other leader to get the Roman Empire out of its near-collapse situation. He had humble origins and climbed up the ranks in the army, up to becoming emperor. And as emperor, he won an incredible series of victories against barbarian peoples. The Alemanni, the Goths, the Vandals, the Sarmatians, and more. And he reunified the empire by force, which had become the only way possible at the time. He remained emperor only for 5 years, but his legacy was major. Coming from the army, having also promised Sol that he would promote his cult if he obtained a victory over his enemies, which he did, it is not completely surprising that Aurelian had this particular devotion to Sol Invictus. And so, in 274, he made the figure of Sol the chief god of the empire. And this time, it worked. It was no longer the whim of a teenager, like Elagabalus, but rather the will of the emperor of the century, in a sense. The Roman elite accepted this, and the cult of Sol Invictus became a feature of Rome and other major Roman cities. From this moment on, the depictions, the iconography of Sol grows a lot, on mosaics, on paintings, or on coins. This is well known and documented, but the type of religious practices or the rites associated with Sol Invictus are still quite obscure. We know very little of them, just that Sol Invictus had temples and a major festival that was set on the 25th of December, the day of the solstice. Aurelian put Sol at the top of his personal pantheon and encouraged the veneration of this god as the most important one. But it would be a mistake to call this an attempt at monotheism. The existence of other gods, or even the validity of their worship, was never attacked by the emperors at the time, nor by the cult of Sol Invictus. At most, it could be called a form of loose monotheism, and there is a term for that, henotheism, the fact of putting one deity well above all others and worship it exclusively. But it was not monotheism, because traditional Roman religion continued to exist. And while the cult of Sol Invictus spread to the cities of the empire, there was one monotheist religion also growing at the time, Christianity. And it is finally Christianity that replaced Sol Invictus. The successors to Aurelian were less enthusiastic than he was in promoting the sun god, but they let it in its prominent spot. It is finally under the Emperor Constantine I, who reigned in the first half of the 4th century, that the cult of Sol Invictus lost its privilege of being the imperial religion. Constantine converted to Christianity and played a big role in making Christian practice legal, while elevating the status of Christianity. Sol Invictus did not disappear overnight. There was a resistance to the conversion led by Constantine, and setbacks, but eventually, in a few decades, Christianity became the imperial religion of Rome for good, and Sol Invictus declined all along the 4th century. The last known inscription mentioning him is from 387 AD, near the end of the 4th century. So you noted that the festival of Sol Invictus was on the 25th of December, a date now famous to be Christmas Day. Early Christianity also used the symbol of the sun a lot, way more than today, and sometimes Jesus Christ was associated with the sun in images or in writings. The early church sometimes called Jesus Sol Justitiae, Son of Righteousness. Hence the theory that when a day was chosen to celebrate the birthday of Jesus Christ, it was set on the 25th of December to capitalize on the existing tradition of the Sol Invictus festival, which itself had been set on the day where the Romans placed the winter solstice. In reality, the astronomical solstice is not necessarily on the 25th. It falls around this date, and it changes from one year to the next. The scriptures do not give precise, explicit information about this date, but it is not completely guaranteed that the Sol Invictus festival was the reason or the only reason why Christmas was set on the 25th of December. it is possible, but another theory is that the day of Christmas was placed just 9 months after March the 25th, a date that would have been chosen before as Christ's conception, the Annunciation. And if it was really the case, if the 25th of March for the Annunciation had been decided before, the 25th of December for Christmas was a logical choice just 9 months later to keep the calendar coherent. In any case, it is likely that maintaining an existing festival, while changing its significance, helped the adoption of the new religion across the Roman Empire. Our second figure tonight is a god that traveled and morphed in surprising ways, from ancient Persia to Rome, Mithra. Originally, Mithra was a god that the Persians venerated as part of their state religion, Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest organized faiths in the world. It emerged in the 2nd millennium BC in Persia, in Iran, and it is called Zoroastrianism after its prophet Zoroaster. At the core of this faith, which still exists, there would be about 100,000 faithful left across the world. There is the belief in a supreme being, uncreated and benevolent, Ahura Mazda, that is fundamentally good and is opposed to an enemy, Angra Mainyu, a destructive spirit that is fundamentally evil. Followers of Zoroastrianism have this cosmology defined by the fight between good and evil, and the belief that at the end of our times, good, Ahura Mazda, will triumph over evil. In practice, it is much more complicated than that. And as the official religion of antique Persian empires for more than 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism has a very rich history. It declined and almost disappeared following the Muslim conquest of ancient Persia of Iran. Scholars are divided in their view of Zoroastrianism as a monotheistic or polytheistic religion. Because even though there was one supreme being, Ahura Mazda, there were godlike figures too, an entire pantheon. Some even consider Zoroastrianism to be enotheistic, this term I mentioned earlier about Aurelian and Sol Invictus. That is to say, the veneration of a god over all others, without excluding the possible existence of other deities. I am telling you this because among these gods was Mithra. The Zoroastrians have a word, Yazata, that can be translated by God, divinity. But Yazata means worthy of worship, worthy of veneration. So it names more a concept than a singular entity, like a god would be defined in the Western tradition. In practice, these Zoroastrian Yazata, or divinities, were understood as gods by their neighbors, by the Greeks or the Romans. And Mithra was one of them, a deity that could be considered as benevolent and a personification of order. It was the deity of justice, of the sun, of light, of contracts and friendships. he was the patron of everything legal and deeply linked to justice. And even though we do not have that much information about how, when, or to what extent this figure was worshipped in ancient Persia, we know it was a significant, well-known, and probably well-liked popular deity. A sign of this is that Mithra was often represented in pre-Muslim art and architecture. Like for Roman gods, Persian gods traveled with the political expansion of their civilization. And the expansion of the Persian Empire by the middle of the first millennium BC was major, spectacular. The Persians, the Achaemenid Empire, named after its ruling dynasty, became the largest and most populated the world had ever seen, occupying almost the entire Middle East, from India to Turkey and Egypt, threatening Greece. It is this threat that the Greeks united to fight, and this empire that ultimately Alexander the Great defeated and conquered. So, with the expansion of the Achaemenid, the cult of Mithra had spread well beyond Iran, the Iranian plateau where it had originated. Few Zoroastrian divinities really became popular out of Persia, but Mithra did. In Anatolia, in particular, in modern Turkey, where it was present during the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic is the name given to the period after the conquests of Alexander, when the Middle East was strongly influenced politically and culturally by Greece, and sometimes vice versa. The cult of Mithra also formed roots among Greek populations. From the Greek world, Mithra continued to travel and passed to the Roman world when Rome was expanding fast to the eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century BC and AD. The encounter of this originally Iranian deity with Roman society produced an original phenomenon, the development of Mithraism, a cult of Mithra in Rome and many parts of the Roman Empire, Mithra being renamed Mithras with an S, but one that had very little to see, almost nothing actually, with the original Mithra. Mithraism was a mystery religion centered on Mithras. But mystery religion, what does it mean? A mystery religion was a religious practice or a religious school of the Greco-Roman world that was secret and secretive. Only initiates could participate in these. If you think of large religions, their doctrines and their set of practices may be hard to understand or seem obscure to outsiders. But they are not hidden. They have scriptures that you are even invited to read. They have reference texts, doctrines. Most of the time their ceremonies are public, and you are also invited to join. Actually, they would be happy to see you convert, embrace the same faith. And they have ministers, representatives, figures of authority, who are also public and accessible. A mystery religion is the opposite of this. It forms a secret society that may try to recruit, but always very discreetly. The beliefs and rituals are not made public, And you need to be initiated as a member to start discovering what it is all about. And oftentimes, in the antique world, your initiation was just the beginning of a journey. There would be various degrees, various grades of initiation, that each would give the faithful access to new revelations and a higher status within the group. If this sounds a lot like a religious cult, a sect, this is no coincidence. This is exactly what a mystery religion was. There is no reason to believe that they preyed on their members like so many modern sects do, but they were religious sects. In Antiquity, these secret religions were rather popular in Greece or in the Roman Empire, and across different social classes, especially in cities and in the military. There was probably something appealing in the mystery itself. These cults were exotic, so it made people dream and fantasize. And as an initiate, it gave you a sense of worth, if not of superiority. It came with friends or acquaintances that could be useful outside, to conduct business, for example. So we have many signs that this type of mystery religions prospered. And in the Roman world, Mithraism became a little phenomenon. Not a massive thing. The cult of Mithras never went mainstream. It was only small groups forming circles. But it became quite widespread, from Roman Britain to Spain to the Middle East, and obviously the city of Rome itself. In all these parts of the Roman Empire, there were groups that engaged in this secretive cult. The Mithras they worshipped had very little to do with the Iranian Mithra. Modern historians generally agree that, at most, Mithras reflected the perception that the Romans had of the Persian Mithra, because they knew this god was from Persia, and that was probably part of the appeal. It was foreign, exotic. But instead of expanding the Zoroastrian cult into the Roman world, the Roman believers completely reinvented this deity. The cult was popular, in particular in the western part of the Roman Empire, and for a long time, from the 1st to the 4th century AD, it was popular among the Roman army, and what we would call the Roman urban middle class or upper middle class. Artisans, for example, or traders. What we know of Mithraism had to be guessed from the study of iconography and the secret places where they met, often in underground temples. We can suppose that Mithraism and Christianity could have looked a bit alike in the first centuries to people who didn't know these religions. The Mithraists because they hid voluntarily and were always discreet. The Christians for different reasons. Their cult was illegal in Rome. They were persecuted, and so they needed to hide. Mithraism was heavy on symbols, astrology, that for the Romans was also associated with the Orient. They saw it as a Babylonian practice. And the average Roman did not necessarily distinguish clearly the Babylonians from the Persians. Newcomers to the cult probably entered at the first grade of initiation, called Korax, which meant raven or crow, and from there, by submitting themselves to years of learning and tests, by spending time with their fellow believers and participating in rituals of an unknown kind, they could rise. The second grade was called Nymphus, meaning bridegroom, the third Miras, soldier, all the way up to the seventh grade, Pater, father. It is unclear whether all members went through this ladder of grades, or if it was just for priests, and we also ignore the exact rituals that they performed in their secret temples. More than 400 sites of Mithraic cult have been studied, and from them it seems the groups were small and not necessarily connected between them. This cult was very decentralized, and probably that only men were accepted into these chapters of the cult, because the lists of members that were found engraved on the walls are all males. It also seems a major aspect of the rituals was participating in feasts, in banquets. In these hidden temples that are called Mithria, a Mithrium in the singular, a lot of food residues and eating utensils were almost invariably discovered. And it is supposed that these banquets were celebrations of the god. Associated to Mithra, the sun god Sol was also frequently depicted in Mithria, and a whole mythology and doctrine probably existed, but it got mostly lost. A figure that comes back systematically in the decoration of the Mithria is the god Mithras slaying a bull. The meaning of this scene is unknown. Was it a way of symbolically defeating evil, or a reference to the creation of the world, or something else? And other engravings or statues that often come back show Mithras and Sol eating together. It is believed that the practice of banqueting in the temples had something to do with this. There were also images of Mithra being born from a rock, and a mysterious figure of a man with a lion head that is not Mithra or Sol. Actually, 2000 years later, the real content of Mithraism, its doctrine, its beliefs, even the nature of its rites, all of this remains very mysterious. In the 4th century AD, Mithraism became prey to persecution, as Christianization was happening, and the Christian emperors were no longer tolerating other religions. So, as all remnants of the old religious order, Mithraism was attacked, and it became illegal. Maybe its secrecy helped it last longer than other cults, but it declined, and by the 5th century it became extinct. At least no further archaeological remains indicating that the cult went on could ever be found. Here again, the historiography evolved. At some point, it was believed that Mithraism could have been almost a competitor to Christianity, due to the same secretive nature of their practices, even though the Christians went into hiding not by choice, but to protect themselves. They never searched for secrecy for itself, and quite the opposite. They wished to convert as many people as possible. modern historians are way less convinced by this theory, because Mithraism was widespread but far less popular. It never involved more than a few thousands or at most tens of thousands of Romans at any given time. Christianity started small, but by the 3rd and 4th centuries, it had grown dramatically and organically to the point of becoming dominant. The Christian doctrine and practice was always much more efficient at gaining followers. So Mithraism was never a threat to Christianity. It was not an alternative that could have possibly changed the course of history, because it was just too small. And by the 5th and 6th centuries, the name of Mithras, this ancient god from Persia that had been reimagined by the Romans, had already disappeared from records and from memories. Our next two deities are going to take us to Mesopotamia. First with Inanna, a goddess also known as Ishtar, the name she got later in Babylon. It is believed that originally Inanna and Ishtar were two separate deities and were not related. Inanna was worshipped 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in Uruk, the ancient Sumerian city. And in the 3rd millennium BC, more than 4,000 years ago, during the Akkadian Empire, the two goddesses were conflated with one another and came to be regarded as the same goddess. And after that, the cult of Inanna, Ishtar, lasted for another 3,000 years and spread well beyond Mesopotamia. This is why the name Ishtar is probably more famous than Inanna. But the origin of this deity can be traced back to ancient Sumer. And this makes her one of the oldest known deity in the entire world. So the Sumerian Inanna was already an important goddess, but we don't know exactly how she was regarded, because her sphere of power in Sumer, the fields where she supposedly intervened, were many and were often contradictory. But her name appears in various archaeological remains, including a famous relic, the Uruk vase, which depicts rows of men bringing offerings to Inanna. We also know that in Sumer she was associated with the planet Venus. The city of Uruk and the Sumerian civilizational area declined in the 3rd millennium BC as new powers replaced them, and first the Akkadian Empire, where Inanna and Ishtar merged, as I said before, into a single goddess. From this point on, the importance and the cult of Ishtar are better known. And she was associated with different fields. She had a caring, maternal aspect, being the goddess of love and procreation, by extension of fertility too, always a major topic of concern for these antique agricultural societies. But that wasn't all. She also had a tougher or more repressive side, being also the goddess of war and political power. Within the Akkadian Empire, her fame grew and temples to Ishtar appeared all across Mesopotamia, instead of being confined to Uruk as she was initially. By comparing how often she was mentioned and how many buildings were dedicated to her, compared with other gods, we know that she became one of the most, if not the most, worshipped deity by the Akkadians. And this popularity went on under the Assyrian Empire, the successor to Akkad. The Assyrians had a national god, Ashur, that could also be deemed a forgotten god, and maybe I'll tell you about him in a future story. Ashur was a major deity to them, but they still placed Ishtar above him. She ranked as the highest deity in their pantheon. And she then remained very popular among the following civilization, the Babylonians, the new masters of Mesopotamia in the first millennium BC. You may have heard of the Ishtar Gate, a monumental gate in Babylon. It consisted of a double gate with a smaller frontal one and a second, bigger section behind it. The frontal gate was reconstructed at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and even though it is only part of the building, it gives an idea of how magnificent this gate was. It is called Ishtar Gate because it represents various Babylonian gods and goddesses, including Ishtar. The Babylonian Empire expanded well beyond Mesopotamia. It reached the Mediterranean, and in the Levant, in modern Syria, Ishtar strongly influenced other local deities. We don't exactly know if these divinities are transpositions of Ishtar to other cultures, or if they are pre-existing deities that were influenced by her. These include Astarte, a Phoenician goddess that the Phoenicians, who were sailors and traders, disseminated all across the Mediterranean, as far west as Spain. It is believed that directly, or via Astarte, Ishtar influenced the Greek goddess Aphrodite, Venus in Roman tradition, the goddess of love, seduction, and sensuality. As a great power, Babylon was at its peak by the mid-first millennium BC, and after that, Mesopotamian civilizations lost their independence, and the Persians, their neighbors to the east, became the new masters of the Middle East. But the Persians did not try to impose their religion, and Ishtar remained one of the most popular and influent cults in the region. This went on after the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great. And when Greek-dominated kingdoms in the Near East were replaced by Rome, transformed into Roman provinces, the cult of Ishtar kept prospering. It really began to decline in the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. It was victim of the spreading of Christianity in particular. But the decline was very slow and gradual. It was only in the 5th or 6th century that the cult of Ishtar fully disappeared, slightly after or at the same time as the last ancient Egyptian temples closed, and many other deities from Phoenicia, Greece, or Rome were also abandoned by their last followers at the time. Ishtar had been worshipped for about 4,000 years, though, and this may have made her the longest-lasting continuous cult of a deity in human history. Beside the religious aspect, Ishtar ended up as a major figure in Mesopotamian myths and stories. She intervened in the story of Gilgamesh, a story I told you already. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, at least in the version that we know of this story, she is not benevolent at all. In this version, she unleashes the Bull of Heaven, a terrifying monster, because she is angered by Gilgamesh's refusal to become her consort, and her actions result in the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh's best friend. But this is just one story, and there are many more involving Ishtar. In a famous myth centered on her, she descended to the underworld, a dark cavern located deep below the ground. The master of the underworld, its queen, was her older sister, Ereshkigal, a goddess of death. But when she reached the throne room of her sister in the underworld, Ishtar was judged and found guilty by the judges of the underworld, a group of gods called the Anunnaki, and they struck her dead, meaning that she was now prisoner of the underworld, and she owed her life to the god Enki, the creator and one of the Anunnaki, who sent her back to the surface, to the world of the living. Contrary to what her role in the Epic of Gilgamesh suggests, Ishtar was generally a positive, benevolent being. But the Mesopotamians also had more ambivalent creatures in their pantheon, and one of them was Pazuzu, the demon. Pazuzu acquired a little fame in the West 50 years ago, because it was supposed to be the demon in The Exorcist, which was a novel in 1971, before becoming a movie in 1973. Obviously, this Pazuzu of The Exorcist has nothing to see with the Mesopotamian deity. Pazuzu was a demon to the Mesopotamians, an evil spirit, but one that could also be useful. Historically, we have no portrait of this entity before the first millennium BC. That is to say, more than 3,000 years after the appearance of Inanna in Sumer. And we don't really know when Pazuzu first appeared. But it was probably one of the last Mesopotamian deities to do so. In the Mesopotamian pantheon, there were several demons called Lilu, an Akkadian word for spirit or demon. So several demons that personified the winds. And their king was Pazuzu, who was also the master of the southwestern wind. But Pazuzu had two main aspects. As a wind demon, he was believed to be wild and cruel, really an evil, chaotic figure that went against culture, civilization, and humanity in general. But he was also a domestic demon, a creature that could be invoked and used to protect homes, by turning his threatening aspect and his violence against unwanted spirits, against other demons that would supposedly fear him. And it is in this second dimension, as a domestic spirit, that his statues and figurines multiplied, an image that you may have seen already. He was often represented with a man's body, but the head of a monster, like a mix of human and lion head. and 2 pairs of wings. His name and his role also appear in multiple texts about magic, rituals, or on the back of his statues. These large or small statues would typically be placed in homes to protect them from external threats, from bad luck and all sorts of misfortune. A lot of Pazuzu heads have also been discovered in all sorts of materials: terracotta, iron, bone, bronze, or glass. These small heads could also be worn as brooches or on necklaces. It seems pregnant women would often wear their little Pazuzu head as a necklace to protect the baby from evil forces. The main threat Pazuzu was supposed to protect people from was his archenemy, Lamashtu, a female demon and goddess that was fully malevolent and would try to attack women during childbirth or kidnap their newborn children. Of 2 evils, Pazuzu was the least dangerous and frightening, and so he had his utility. And from the quantity of amulets and mentions of his name, we can assume he was quite popular, possibly well-liked even, despite his demonic nature. Pazuzu did not travel much beyond the frontiers of Mesopotamia, unlike Ishtar, and his decline began earlier than hers. Once the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, invaded and occupied Mesopotamia in the second half of the first millennium BC, Mesopotamian gods began to lose ground, replaced for a part by Iranian beliefs such as Zoroastrianism and its various figures, including Mithra. It is hard to tell precisely when ancient Mesopotamian religion disappeared, because it took centuries. The last blows were dealt by Christianization in the first centuries of our era. But when Christianization began, it seems Pazuzu had already been forgotten, because the last depictions of him discovered are from before the birth of Jesus Christ. In any case, Pazuzu fully fell into oblivion, and his name only survived on Mesopotamian tablets and engravings, hidden in ruins or buried underground. And it is only in modern times that these records were unearthed, revealing the existence of a once powerful and revered demon of the wind. And now, let's embark on our last story for tonight. This one is going to take us to an ancient ghost city on the Nile. For centuries, it went forgotten in the sands of the Egyptian desert. Before we go more into detail, let me tell you a quick true story. Once upon a time, in ancient Egypt, during the New Kingdom, when Egypt was wealthier, more refined and more powerful than ever, a new pharaoh ascended to the throne under the name of Amenhotep IV. There had been generations and generations of pharaohs before him, many different dynasties. He was from the 18th dynasty, and all of them had been the guardians of Egyptian traditions and religion for so many centuries that it now seemed this order existed since the origins of time, and was as old as the world and the gods themselves. But Amenhotep was different, and instead of following the ways of tradition, he broke with it. With his queen, Nefertiti, the royal couple rejected all gods, especially the one whose cult and priests were the most influential and powerful at the time, Amun. Instead, they decided to worship an entity placed even above gods, Aten, the sun disk, the deity that gave life to everything. This was a period of internal troubles in Egypt, because the population didn't like it and remained attached to the old ways, and the priests of Amun and other rejected gods plotted against the pharaoh, waiting for the moment to take their revenge. But Amenhotep didn't let this stop him. He changed his name to Akhenaten and decided to found a new capital, Akhetaten, Aten's horizon. Akhetaten would replace Thebes and mark the beginning of a new golden age for Egypt, now under the protection of the Aten, the sun disk, the only deity that mattered. Under his rule, not only did the new pharaoh try to change religious ways, even the age-old Egyptian art that had barely changed in 2000 years had to reinvent itself. Against his people, against the priests, Akhenaten prevailed because he was the pharaoh, and pharaohs were half-gods. Akhetaten was built in a few years on the Nile, halfway between Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt, the delta in the north. Thousands and thousands of workers were involved. The new capital couldn't wait. It was inaugurated, and for more than a decade, it became the capital of Egypt, from where the empire was ruled and Akhenaten's family resided. The pharaoh, his wife Nefertiti, their 6 daughters, and Akhenaten's other children. But outside the capital, Egyptians remained reluctant to adopt Aten, and when Akhenaten died, his successor, young pharaoh Tutankhamun, abandoned the new city and returned to Thebes. He was firmly under the influence of the priests of Amun, who got back their wealth and privileges, as Akhetaten was emptied of its population. The old order was restored all across Egypt, and the following pharaohs did everything they could to erase Akhenaten and his heresy from memories. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were hammered, documents bearing his name were either burnt or rewritten. Egypt moved on. More glorious pages were still to come, like the reign of Ramesses II. Desert sand and the passing of time slowly erased Akhetaten from memories. More centuries passed. Egypt declined, was invaded and annexed by the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Turks, and the existence of the heretic pharaoh, his queen, and their lost city fell into oblivion. Akhetaten is now called Amarna, and this is the place we are now going to visit. Amarna is located on the east bank of the Nile River. Traditionally in Egypt, the east was the place for the living, and the west, where the sun sets, the place for the dead. In Thebes, Luxor, nowadays. Most people lived on the east bank, and funerary complexes like the Valley of the Kings are on the west bank. Amarna was built on a virgin site. No trace of earlier urbanization has been found, and this seems logical for a new start. Construction began around year 5 of Akhenaten's reign, and probably lasted for about 4 years, which was very short. The Egyptians built in stone, but this was complicated, slow, and expensive, so it was limited to the most important buildings like temples and tombs. All the rest, including the pharaoh's palaces, were mainly built in brick. Bricks were dried in the sun and immediately available for buildings. Then they were probably covered, layered with plaster to smooth the walls. Stone monuments are the face of ancient Egypt nowadays, because they lasted. But the Egyptians lived in brick buildings that have now entirely disappeared most of the time. Akhenaten needed to be built fast, and this is why stone was barely used. The city was entirely made of mud brick. This means it disappeared, but at the same time, because it was occupied only for a few years and never remodeled, it provides an unique example of the plan of an ancient Egyptian city. The city spread on 8 miles, 13 kilometers, along the Nile, and it was encircled with 14 stelas, that is to say, stone slabs, with inscriptions that detailed its founding by Akhenaten. These stelas have been eroded, but they provided precious information about the city when they started to be studied. Much of the city was laid out along a royal road, a central avenue from north to south, and the royal residences were located to the north. In the middle, there was a religious and administrative area, and to the south, a residential district. To the center there was a great temple dedicated to the Aten and a smaller one. Between these there was another royal residence used for ceremonies apparently, that was connected to the temples by a bridge or a ramp. Behind this royal residence was an administrative complex, and in this part of the ruins, archaeologists found archive tablets known as the Amarna letters. They are a diplomatic correspondence, and they provided a lot of information about the situation of Egypt, especially in relation to its dependencies in the Levant in the 14th century BC. To the south, in the residential area, lived powerful nobles who built estates there, and the studio of a sculptor called Thutmose was discovered untouched and revealed a lot about the art of the period. A famous bust of Nefertiti, which has become one of the most famous Egyptian antiques in the world, was found there in 1912. It is in Berlin nowadays. Since the bust was discovered, Nefertiti has become famous as a model of beauty. It is true that this bust from the 14th century BC looks incredibly realistic, as if it was a classical Greek sculpture with exactly the kind of facial features that the Greeks, and to a large part Western societies nowadays, associate with feminine beauty: symmetry, thin features, a long and gracious neck. There are conflicting theories about the origins of Nefertiti. There is no doubt that she was born in an aristocratic family, but she could have been related to Akhenaten, a cousin, or even his sister. It was common for pharaohs to marry their sisters. Incest was prohibited in Egypt, but not for pharaohs. They were the one exception, because it was believed that royal blood shouldn't be diluted. But she could also have been a stranger, maybe an Anatolian princess, married to young Amenhotep for diplomatic reasons. What we know is that she had at least 6 children with Akhenaten, 6 daughters, and she was elevated to a higher status than probably any queen before her. She appeared almost as a co-regent. She was called the mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt on steles, and some Egyptologists even believed that she may have become a female pharaoh for a short time or during a regency, during the transition between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. Her beauty was praised everywhere, but this was really common in ancient Egypt. Texts and statues were not meant to be realistic. They served to celebrate their subject. However, this was less true during the parenthesis that is the reign of Akhenaten, because for 1 or 2 decades, Egyptian art, painting, sculpture, changed markedly, at least the representations of the royal family. The style evolved towards a highly realistic or even unflattering way of depicting people. The pharaoh is shown almost feminine, with a curvy body, a prominent stomach and a very long face. Maybe this is what he looked like, and there has been theories that he could have been affected by a disease or a genetic condition. But these pictures of Akhenaten are in stark contrast to traditional representations of pharaohs. They had traditionally very masculine features, muscles, large shoulders, thin waist. The art of Amarna sometimes look almost like a caricature. And in this context, the bust of Nefertiti seems to belong to another period or style. But it doesn't, so it is not impossible that she was effectively an embodiment of classical beauty. However revolutionary and surprising the revolution started by Akhenaten, it probably shouldn't be understood as just a spiritual move. Maybe there were more political power struggles behind it. First, because if he managed to impose an entirely new god to Egypt, it is probably because he was supported by the army. The Egyptian army under the 18th dynasty was a considerable power. At the time, Egypt was at the top of its prosperity. There were no internal threats, and the frontiers had been pushed away in every direction, especially to the east in the Levant and to the south in Nubia. Egypt still had enemies, but they were far away, and the kingdom could maintain a numerous and powerful military. Sometimes dynasties were even created or continued by generals who grabbed the throne. Along Egyptian history, it happened many times. Don't believe it remained hereditary for so long. So having support from the army was crucial for pharaohs, and especially support against another major political force, the priests, in particular at the time, the priests of Amun. Temples in ancient Egypt were very powerful institutions. They were economic centers. They owned a large part of the land, and their high priests could be extremely influential, to the point of threatening the pharaohs themselves. And during the New Kingdom, the one cult that gained prominence was the cult of Amun, by far the most worshipped and wealthiest god of them all. Amun was a minor deity during the Old and Middle Kingdoms. The priests of Ra or Osiris were probably much more influential. And Amun was a local deity based in Thebes and its surroundings. But in the New Kingdom, the capital moved to Thebes, and the wealth and influence of the priests of Amun became major over the generations. Amun almost absorbed other gods, and of course Egypt remained polytheist. But in Upper Egypt, religion became close to an equivalent of worshipping Amun. So maybe the choice to break with Thebes and to create a new religious order was also a power move, a power grab, or a reaction against the rampant transformation of Egypt into a theocracy ruled by the priests of Amun. The new religion imposed by Akhenaten was not really monotheism. Even in Akhenaten, other deities were revered, in fact, if not officially, then by at least some of the people who lived in the city. But despite the creation of this new capital and all the powers that pharaohs had, the cult of the Aten never really replaced old gods. And when the pharaoh died, traditions immediately came back in force. 2,000 years couldn't be erased in 15. Maybe there was a regency, maybe by Nefertiti. It's hard to know because many records of the time have been destroyed to erase the memory of Akhenaten. But in a few years, the capital had moved back to Thebes. The priests had recovered their wealth and influence, and the city of Akhenaten was abandoned. Maybe it was partly destroyed to make it disappear quicker, but as it was made of brick and occupied for such a short time, it's hard to know. The site didn't fall completely into oblivion. There are also traces of occupation nearby 15 centuries later, during the Roman and early Christian periods. But bit by bit, the ruins became invisible from the Nile. Sand covered everything, and the memory of the city was lost. It is only in modern times, starting with Napoleon's expedition in Egypt, and then many more scientific missions, including the German one that unearthed Nefertiti's bust a century ago, that the history of Amarna, the modern name of the city, and the lives of Akhenaten and Nefertiti came back to light. The ruins are unimpressive nowadays. They are not really visited. Only archaeological missions keep working on the site in the hope of better understanding this very particular, unique moment in the history of ancient Egypt. We have reached the end of our exploration journey. Let me know if you would like to hear more stories of forgotten gods, because there are many more. But this is all for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. I'll be back soon with another one, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.